Good morning, everybody. Thank you to the faculty members who made the time today, and thank you to people on Zoom who are tuning in. So, as Professor Holo said, today I'll be talking about digital Shakespeare's as performance, which I argue to be just as palpable as theatric performances for the ways that it encourages and espouses liveness. So, let's begin. In the theaters of Shakespeare's London, playgoers who stood within the yard directly in front of the stage were called groundlings. Groundlings had satirically been known as excessively noisy, rowdy, or inattentive. That's according to Astington. Even Hamlet himself describes groundlings as, for the most part, are capable of nothing but inexplicable dumb shows and noise. The open air structure of the Globe in other early modern theaters might be the culprit for such boisterous behavior. Tiffany Stern describes early modern London spectators as an important element of the performance. I quote, spectators and actors clearly saw each other and borrowed reactions from one another. Shakespeare's original audience was as well lit as the actors and as visible and sometimes as talkative. It was an audience constantly in need of taming. It might throw stones or even laths. It often threw fruit, which was available for sale throughout performances. Unquote. So, this kind of theater going behavior would seem so base and rude to us in the 21st century, where in order to watch a play like Miss Saigon, we need to pay thousands of pesos to sit in the dark, shut up, and enjoy the show. So, where has the raucous and participatory nature of Shakespeare's theater gone? Shakespeare's long and complex journey from stage to page might offer an insight, but that's another fascinating lecture on its own. I bring up this piece of theater history to make this point that the theaters of Shakespeare's London have always been participatory. And although this culture is lost to us now, I would like to show in this lecture that we might rediscover it in the form of digital Shakespeares. Today, I'm going to present and examine three forms of Shakespeare in the digital platform, which are just as palpable as theatric performances and just as sensible to feeling as to sight. These forms treat the medium or technology they use as a stage and not as a mere transmitter of performance. I asked a central question. How do these digital forms challenge the ways that Shakespeare is performed and prompt reassessment of the conventional associations that Shakespeare has with theatric liveness, text, and spectatorship? I argue that by its marriage of stage and medium, digital Shakespeares encourage different levels of participation and engagement. Thus, these digital Shakespeares give agency to users in creating Shakespeare, uncouple the conventional associations between the Shakespearean text and Shakespearean performance, and finally, subvert notions of liveness in dramatic performance. So, this topic is born out of my MA study, which I defended in 2019 and have since revisited because of recent developments in the field ushered by the COVID-19 lockdown. What has long been existing in digital media and excluded from academic purview suddenly comes with urgency and necessity because of theaters shut down all over the world. Before the pandemic, I had categorized these Shakespeares into platforms or websites they had used, but as the study of Shakespeare in digital media expands, I've come to realize that the essence of digital Shakespeare as performance lies not in the platforms used or what Pascal Abisher might call technologies of performance, but rather in the kind of participation and engagement that they encourage. These three forms will thusly be called bite-sized bards, social bards, and unmuted bards. I'll explain each one later. So, W.B. Worthen is one of the first to think of performance beyond the single room shared between actors and audiences. In Shakespeare, in The Force of Modern Performance, he considers the hypertext to be a kind of cyber Shakespeare performance for its embodiment and enactment of print, claiming that hypertextual sites, I'm quoting from him, enable, perhaps even invite readers to engage with Shakespeare with dramatic writing and with reading in some characteristic ways, unquote. Conventionally, theater and performance studies tend to regard stage performance as the sole site of drama's materialization. That's from Worthen. Peggy Phelan, for example, contends that, quote, performances only life is in the present. thereby highlighting the necessity for players and spectators to occupy the same space synchronically. Margaret Kidney states that, quote, live performance by nature of its medium disappears as quickly as it happens. One can attend the production multiple times, but one can never see the same production twice, unquote. Yet again, there's the emphasis over performance's ephemerality and a concept of liveness rooted in synchronicity and co-presence. While I do not deny the value and liveness of bodily and temporal performance, I do not consider these to be necessarily participatory, as most conventional dramatic performances do not encourage engagement nor give agency to spectators in the same way that digital Shakespeares do. Kidney, however, acknowledges later on that new technologies might complicate and give rise to different kinds of spectatorship, and indeed they have. Over the past 13 years, we've seen Shakespearean scholars such as Geoff Way, Aaron Sullivan, and Pascal Abisher and Stephen O'Neill problematize the role of digital or new media in reshaping Shakespearean performance and spectatorship. Geoff Way in Social Shakespeare questions the validity of the terms live and mediatized when it comes to social media performances, arguing that social media platforms, in and of themselves, become the very stage of dramatic performance. As the boundary between live performance and mediated performance is blurred, the spectator's role in it becomes an interesting point of discussion. New media has allowed spectators to become users who are able to interact and participate in dramatic performance. Erin Sullivan writes precisely about audience presence, participation, and aliveness in her essay, The Audience is Present, where she examines the discussion threads that unfolded in Twitter during and after broadcasts of Shakespearean plays. She concludes that while the audience of such broadcasts are geographically dispersed, social media is able to become a site for experiencing collective aliveness, therefore achieving a kind of participation that might even surpass an in person production. Participation in some form before, during, and after the performance seems to be key in thinking about the Shakespeare user, quoted from Faisal and Geeds. Whereas Sullivan discusses participation in meaning making via online discussions, Pascal Abisher studies how digital performances during the pandemic generated liveness, a sense of community, and emotive responses, as spectators are given direct hand in influencing the events of the performance. What's common in these theories of liveness and performance in the digital age is the underlying assumption that liveness, quoting from Philip Auslander, is an interaction produced through our engagement with the object and our willingness to accept its claim. Whether this engagement is achieved through synchronous and physical co-presence or through virtual congregation or event connectedness does not seem to be an issue. Thus, I was prompted to reconsider the wide vista of digital Shakespeares, not by the technologies utilized by performances like TikTok, YouTube, or Zoom, but rather by the engagement that they generate. An engagement that brings about a sense of individual or collective ownership and agency over Shakespeare, an engagement that is sometimes raucous, but always participatory. In the next sections of the lecture, I'll be introducing each type of digital Shakespeare and show that each one is a performance that facilitates live engagement between and among spectator, creator, institution, actor, and ultimately engagement with Shakespeare as a cultural icon. These new practices of performance imposed upon Shakespeare are rooted in a kind of digital spectatorship that's characterized by the 21st century tendency towards use, a tendency that's created by, quote, Web 2.0's emphasis on participation, unquote, from Faisal and Geeds. Through this lecture or study, I hope to be able to fill what Douglas Lanier finds lacking in the study of global Shakespeare, which is attention to the, quote, liberatory or progressive potentialities, however fleeting, and perhaps ultimately compromised, that contemporary Shakespearean adaptation can offer, the joys of irreverence, anarchy, and excess, the intimation of community. So the first digital Shakespeares that I'll be talking about are bite-sized bards, which are small, easily consumed media that aren't necessarily platform-specific and whose original creator might be difficult or impossible to trace. This category of digital Shakespeares might be the most varied and difficult to archive, as it may come in many forms and spread out across many different platforms or websites. They may come in the image macro meme form, as you could see here, but they may also be short form videos, as in TikTok and Instagram Reels. But not all bite sized bards come are in not all bards in bite-sized forms rather are performances. Some are more informative in nature, like an infographic or a fan art of Shakespeare of a Shakespearean character. So these examples do not, as Worthen suggests of performance, critically interpret the text's internal dynamics. In this part of the lecture, I will discuss what conceptually binds bite-sized bards as digital performances. It is their quality of replicability, the intertextuality, and playful irreverence that allow them to be live, participatory, and interpretive. So first, bite-sized bards are replicable. This replicability is what allows them to be shared and remade by different users online, thereby contributing to the cultural construction of Shakespeare's online presence. What you see on the screen are some examples of replicability in two ways. First, there's the replication of the blinking guy meme, and I have two examples here, a non-Shakespearean version and a Shakespearean version. There's also the replication of the distracted boyfriend meme, which I'm sure you're familiar with these two memes, in two versions parodying Juliet and Romeo, respectively. On one hand, there is the repetition of the images, the blinking guy and the distracted boyfriend. But more importantly, there's also the repetition of Romeo and Juliet in different meme forms, particularly Romeo and Juliet's double suicide and their deaths. So each one revealing a critical interpretation of the play. Second, bite-sized bards are also intertextual. Intertextuality is what allows these bite-sized bards to acquire humor and become parodic. Bite-sized bards tend to quote or reference existing cultural texts that may have no relevance to Shakespeare. What you see on your screen are intertexts of Shakespeare and other pop culture references from, well, first the Office, the first two, and the third one is from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. So the first two characteristics of bite-sized bards, replicability and intertextuality, pave way to the participation of users in critical and interpretive meaning making. According to Stephen O'Neill, I quote, "The media consumer is an active participant who seeks out new content, repurposes old, and forges new connections with other media users," unquote. The juxtaposition of Shakespeare and other texts allow users to exert control and ownership over the bard. Users and media consumers participate by replicating memes and mixing them with other cultural texts to create a digital artifact that is playfully irreverent and parodic, which is key in making bite-sized bards interactive and therefore live, as it produces engagement, however fleeting, with other users. Take, for example, these two TikTok videos that parody Shakespeare's associations with Britishness and high culture inaccessibility. On the left is a viral TikTok video showing user at Floop the Rocket reading Shakespeare's play with a soundbite called Peaches Confused About Question. This soundbite is a popular meme on TikTok replicated by users to express their reactions to unintelligible texts. On the right is Reed Choi's TikTok video reading Hamlet's soliloquy in a Southern American accent, implicating the difficulty of hearing Shakespeare in its original pronunciation. It's easily seen by numbers that these two short form videos amassed high levels of engagement that creates a feeling of event connectedness and a sense of community. But the quality of interaction sparked by at Read Choice TikTok, the one on the right, is by far the best example of how bite-sized bards generate liveness and participation, as other users in TikTok replicated the video and filmed themselves reciting other lines from Shakespeare's plays in a Southern American accent. So this particular instance illustrates what Stephen O'Neill calls the logic of participatory culture. He says, by way of contrast with older notions of passive media spectatorship, media consumers are understood to have greater opportunities to intervene in media production that was typically, though not universally, the preserve of commercial and professional producers. So, be they anonymously shared memes on social media or short form videos on TikTok, bite sized bards allow individual users to create a Shakespeare of their own and use him to generate engagement and a sense of community with other users. The creators and the audience of bite sized bards may not be congregated in one auditorium, but both experience and participate in the creation of Shakespeare's. There is, quote, a productive attitude to the text as open to further interpretation, especially when they transpose the Shakespearean text to new contexts or combine it with other media. And such an attitude leads to reflections about the role of individual users as opposed to institutional groups like the RSC or the Globe in making Shakespeare. So the second digital Shakespeares that I'll be talking about is social bards. So social bards are performances of Shakespeare's works using social media platforms alone as the stage. In this part of the lecture, I'll be examining two examples of social media performances that deconstruct the conventional idea of the Shakespearean stage in order to, quote, recast Shakespeare's relationship to stage performance and text, unquote, from Lanier. I argue that these social bards generate engagement through its visual articulation of Shakespeare, thus resisting the text centric notion that dramatic performance must always yield to the authority of the dramatic text. Both performances' subversion of stage performance displaces the primacy of Shakespeare's text through its brazen visual rather than verbal storytelling. In the process of adopting social media practices within the platforms used as stage, practices that are rooted in the embeddedness of a life world, these social bards create a kind of engagement that allows spectators to interact, perform with, and be part of the actor or character's life world. So, part of the British Council's Shakespeare Lives campaign was a modern Instagram retelling of A Midsummer Night's Dream. In one of the Instagram posts in the performance, as you could see here, Lysander here is glaring jealously at Hermia and Demetrius, and the caption suggests that the photo was uploaded by Helena with a popular hashtag TBT or Throwback Thursday. It's also worth noting that the uploaded image uses a desaturated filter, making it look like it was taken by film. This is a popular aesthetic practice within the Instagram platform. So, without citing any particular scene or gesturing towards any part of Shakespeare's text, the photo is able to capture one of A Midsummer Night's Dream's central plot conflicts. The Candle Wasters Nothing Much to Do on YouTube offers the same deferment to visual articulation. The web series, which was first released in July 2014, heavily relies on YouTube vlogging aesthetics and practices to adapt Shakespeare's Much Ado to a 21st century high school context. So, video blogs are seen as creative outlets or personal online diaries, quoted from Molyneux, Gibson, and O'Donnell. Majority of vlogs are concerned with and interested in the spectacle of ordinary life. In an essay entitled Cinema Without Show Business, Lewis explains that a vlog is a serial expression of a life world. These expressions are usually moments in a blogger's daily life, might also be the staged and poetic evocations of emotional states. NMTD depends upon this embeddedness in the life world as a visual mode of storytelling and as a way to engage its users. What you see here on the screen is Beatrice speaking directly to the camera as she introduces herself to the viewers. We can clearly see her room as the background of the video, the posters of her fandom, the artworks, her bed, and the little lanterns hanging on her wall. We're treated to see they're sort of the world that they're living in, their personal sort of their lives. We're treated to see the everyday lives of Beatrice, Benedict, Ursula, Hero, and others as they reveal it on their own YouTube channels. So the dominance of these visual articulations of social media Shakespeares are similar to what Michelle Williams examines in Shakespeare and the Moving Image. Williams describes the screen as a medium that I quote, addresses its public through pictures which often replace words, so much so that words may seem out of place or too much speech may be prejudicial to the effect of a film, unquote. Now, although she pertains to film specifically, I find that the same idea applies to social media platforms or social media performances, where words are secondary and the dialogue follows the image. So, the granular nature of social media texts might lend explanation for how social media bards or social bards surrender the authorial text to the visual image due to quote bandwidth limitations, respect for how media is consumed in a network environment, and time investment of the creator, unquote. Texts produced within social media platforms tend to be short and brief. It must be comprehensible at a quick glance. A tweet, an image, or a video that only take a few seconds or minutes worth of our time. Internet users tend to prefer digital texts that take less time to consume because of the massive quantity of information generated online. This is also why NMTD serializes Shakespeare's Much Ado into shorter videos dispersed throughout different channels, which then adds further to the immersion of the viewers in the life worlds of the characters. Here are two screenshots, for example, from Beatrice's vlog on the left and Benedict's vlog on the right, respectively. So the couple's sly remarks about each other from Act 2, Scene 1 of Much Ado are performed as vlog responses. One from Beatrice's YouTube channel, uploaded on 6th of May 2014, and another from Benedict's, uploaded on 7th of May 2014. So a follower of the vlog series will find that all social media platforms, from Benedict's vlog to Hero's Instagram account, consistently and synchronously correspond to the main events of the vlog story. So Ursula also has a channel, and Dogberry and Verges, they also have a YouTube channel. So all of them are sort of respond synchronously with one another. So now, both hashtag Shakespeare No Filter on Instagram and NMTV on YouTube, their subversion of textual authority and their adaptation of the norms, practices, and aesthetics native to social media generate authentic interactions amongst audience. A community of followers is made possible by the social bard's manner of temporal unfolding, thus creating an experience of belonging to a physical and network community of fans that spanned geographical locations and shared in the excitement of participating in a unique ephemeral cultural event, quoted from Abisher and Greenlaw. In this community, users can express their belongingness freely and candidly through the comments. So here's an example of this process, as seen in Nothing Much to Do's episode 18, which expands the implicit past between Beatrice and Benedict. So through a Q&A with the audience, so this is like a screenshot of the Q&A episode. This is Beatrice sort of talks about what happened to her and Benedict, which is something that isn't to be found within the contours of the text. So the video generated user comments as seen in the screenshots here, and viewers, as you can see, form their own conclusions about Beatrice and Benedict's relationship. Some even add information for viewers' understanding, or some are supportive of the relationship of Beatrice and Benedict. So Shakespeare No Filter and NMTD had been among the first performances that harnessed the technologies of social media to facilitate authentic engagement with and amongst the audience. Such performances, according to Erin Sullivan, quote, pushes to consider how the very nature of performance itself might be changing, both on stage and off, as Shakespeare and his publics evolve in response to an increasingly digital world. Dramatic performance had conventionally been confined to the theater, but media technologies have begun to change that. Social Bards, through its visual mode of storytelling that adopts the practices inherent in the social media platforms, uncouple the conventional association between performance and the Shakespearean text. While film and TV does this as well, Social Bards also introduces its own contribution to redefining the nature of performance as participatory and interactive. Lastly, Unmuted Bards. So in 2020, we find that Shakespeare and his publics did not only respond to a world that is increasingly digital, but also to a world that is suddenly locked down. Impelled by the closing of theaters and public spaces worldwide, creative institutions turned to digital media in order to survive and continue to make a living. This too came in many forms: the live streaming of a stage performance, the streaming of a live stage performance, the live performance on a streaming platform, and so on. In all cases, the three words live, performance, and streaming had been prevalent in the 2020 lockdown, and this has naturally prompted recent discourse about the liveness of digital performances. In the book Lockdown Shakespeares, editors Gemma Allred, Benjamin Brodrib, and Erin Sullivan have categorized Lockdown Shakespeares into five kinds: live streamed, Shakespeare in pieces, streamed, virtual theater, and Zoom to YouTube. This lecture is interested in virtual theater, described as, quote, a production which is performed live on Zoom with the audience joining the actors on the call, allowing the audience to interact with the performance, unquote. More than the other forms of lockdown Shakespeare, it is virtual theater where we can find the necessary ingredient of digital Shakespeares that have thus far been discussed, and that is the marriage of stage and medium. The other lockdown Shakespeares enumerated in the book still make distinctions between a physical performance space and an online medium. A great example of this is how big theater companies released a slew of archived recorded performances for public streaming. National Theatre, for example, eventually went on to launch NT at Home, which contains select National Theatre performances available for video streaming. In these cases, there's still a stage that is transmitted by a video or streaming platform online. Such form of lockdown Shakespeare's gives a sense of instead of rather than being theater, quoted from Allred. Although such streams and live streams do create a community of viewers and generate an aliveness akin to Sullivan's claim in studying broadcast TV, I find that they do not subvert what a Shakespearean performance conventionally is. Rather, it is the born digital performances of virtual theater that offer a kind of liveness embodied by the direct participation of the audience, a participation that is important in the narrative. Creation Theater's The Tempest comes close to so comes close to the audience participation that early modern playgoers might have experienced. In the performance, audience members on Zoom, as you can see here on your screen, were encouraged to turn their cameras on and unmute themselves in certain key parts of the performance, almost like the well-lit theaters of Shakespeare's London, where members of the audience can borrow reactions from one another. Such participation, she claims, creates a sense of community that generates the same feeling of congregation in a physical theater. I find in these discussions, though, of virtual theater, an immense effort to uplift digital performances to match that of stage performance. In the same essay, Allred writes that it is the temporal proximity of actor and audience and the embedded markers of ephemeral performance that afford digital theater a new quality of liveness, equivalent to in-person theater, unquote. Virtual theater is undoubtedly creative and playful in creating performances during the lockdown, but I find that the quality of liveness is not quite equivalent to in-person theater, but something of its own distinct kind. Within in-person theaters, we do indeed find live performances where, quote, audiences feel themselves allied with one another with a broader and more capacious sense of public, unquote, from Jill Dolan. The sense of community derived from in-person theater is affective, while virtual theater achieves this feeling in how audience members can see each other's faces and homes. It goes beyond this by eliciting direct participation that affects the narrative flow of the performance. In this part of the lecture, I'll be discussing Creation Theater's 2022 joint virtual production, 2022 production, Friar Lawrence's Confessional, written and performed by Nicholas Osmond, and Big Telly's 2020 Macbeth, directed by Zoe Seaton. Both serve as the best examples of using the medium, or Zoom, and treating it as a stage, thereby combining the locus, the fictional world of the characters, and the platea, the space including the stage and the audience watching it, of the performance. Digital performances produce a meta theatrical acknowledgement of the medium and use this fact to engage the audience in the virtual plays in ways that substantially contributes to the overall performance. So first is Friar Lawrence's confessional. This play unfolds entirely in Zoom calls, interspersed with Friar Lawrence's reading aloud of his emails and texts, as well as TikTok videos of supporting characters. We get a pared down tragedy that focused on Friar Lawrence's work as a Catholic priest during lockdown, rather than having the action taking place in the fictional world of the play, like in The Tempest, the Island of Prospero. Friar Lawrence's confessional entirely takes place on Zoom with an awareness and acknowledgement of this fact. Conflicts within the play had been localized in order to project a Verona that is also plagued by COVID. When Friar Lawrence encouraged Romeo to attend the Capulet ball, he reassured him that the guests will be masked and that vaccination cards will be checked. A banished Romeo mourns his separation from Juliet, whose broadband connection is slow and almost non existent. And characters like Romeo, Juliet, Lady Macbeth, and Malvolio and Prospero, who make appearances in the Shakespeare universe here, enter and exit the Zoom call, which becomes a virtual confessional room. Big Telly's 2020 production, virtual production of Macbeth, on the other hand, plays with a similar blending of the performance's locus and platea to engage the audience members and facilitate high levels of participation. Whereas Friar Lawrence's confessional uses COVID-19 lockdown as the backdrop of the performance, therefore acknowledging the use of Zoom as a stage, Macbeth's setting is also in a lockdown, except that it is the fear of witchcraft rather than a virus that keeps the characters and audience members separated. The three witches, or UK government officials, composed of the Prime Minister, the Chief Scientific Advisor, and the Minister for Economy, are shown in a COVID-19 daily briefing style conference right here in the upper left. Drawing on the closing down of theaters and public spaces, the three witches are shown to be situated in an empty auditorium of the Theatre Royal Brighton, from which they seem to control the events of the narrative and create the world of the virtual play. So what you could see here is one of the witches here on the upper right, and on the lower right, left, one of the witches is sort of unfurling the backgrounds for the next scene. From witchcraft, the Weird Sisters turned to stagecraft in order to create and project the prophecies for Macbeth. On the topic of technologies of performance, Abisher writes that, quote, different technologies, it follows, also reveal different truths that may be particular to that technology and or to the play they mediate. Friar Lawrence's folly is reinforced and revealed through his interactions with the members of the audience in the Zoom call. In these interactions, what is understood is Friar Lawrence's recourse to a recently acquired drug, which, when taken, gives the appearance of death. So in the performance, Friar Lawrence randomly selects members of the audience and then gives them advice for their plight. On the screen are some of the audience members who had been given absolution by the friar. The formula is repeated 2 more times in the play, which always ends with the friar sending them an email to an e-brochure with more information about this recently acquired drug, which is the solution to all of their problems. The repetition of this part of the performance and its inclusion of the audience would be necessary to deliver a tragicomic effect when it was time for Friar Lawrence himself to take the drug in order to escape culpability for Romeo and Juliet's double suicide. Whereas other versions of Romeo and Juliet, in contrast, would highlight Romeo and Juliet's youthful impatience. For example, in the bite-sized bards examples. Friar Lawrence's confessional had used audience members' participation to underscore the extent of his accountability in the play's tragedy. If Friar Lawrence's confessional reveals the good priest's folly through repeated engagement with the audience, Big Telly's 2020 Macbeth reveals an answer to the question that Shakespeare's Scottish play prompts. Who controls what happens in the narrative? Is it the weird sisters, Lady Macbeth, or Macbeth himself? This question of agency finds its answer in how the weird sisters facilitated viewer participation in certain key scenes. On your screen is the opening scene where audience members on Zoom were asked by the three witches to write their locations on a piece of paper as a way to screen which ones may have been exposed to witchcraft and which ones are marked safe. So those who were witchcraft negative had a big check mark appear on their Zoom box, and those who were witchcraft positive had a witch hat filter appear on their heads. The revelation later on that the government officials are witches themselves who can conjure up illusions in the form of Zoom backgrounds tell the audience who might be in control of the story's events. This creates dramatic irony because members of the Zoom meeting clearly know that the witches are manipulating Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and yet they're made to participate in the charade. So one part of the Zoom production asked audience members to wave to Macbeth as he marches on to his coronation, and other parts had the audience members spotlighted as dinner guests in Macbeth's banquet or as witnesses to the succeeding prophecies about Macbeth's downfall. Reviewers of the performance, including Peter Kerwan, find the interactive elements of the play to have no enduring effect on the narrative. I would contend, however, that without such audience participation or spotlighting, the virtual play would not have elicited a feeling of discomfort within the audience as they become complicit to the tragedy of Macbeth. The inclusion of the audience in both in the Tempest, Friar Lawrence's confessional, and Macbeth generates quote liveness, a sense of community, and emotive responses unquote, thereby creating a unique and specifically theatrical event from Abishur and Nicholas. What might contribute to the sense of community is the fact that audience members were encouraged to leave their cameras on. But what is also important is that the inclusion and immersion of the Zoom audience resulted in actor-audience interactions that are ultimately necessary to produce the performance's intended effect and reveal a truth about Shakespeare's play. Shakespeare and new media. Out of a marriage of true minds comes bite-sized bards, social bards, and unmuted bards, which all encourage engagement between and amongst creators, actors, and spectators. And now the bardic question that seems to haunt modern performance. Are they Shakespeare? The question comes from the assumption that there's a true and authentic Shakespeare which all performances must either yield to or deviate from. It's difficult to imagine an original Shakespeare, especially with a plethora of afterlives ranging from Japanese manga to new media performances. Shakespeare in the 21st century is an amalgam of texts, discourses, and cultural artifacts generated through a long history of print and performance. O'Neill describes Shakespeare as mutable and dialogic, for the signifier Shakespeare does not only pertain to the author, but also to an aggregate of adaptations, citations, allusions, uses, transpositions, appropriations, and revisions. Instead of asking, is it Shakespeare, to each new transformation afforded by new technology, I propose to revise the bardic question and ask instead, what does it do to Shakespeare, and why is it important? In all three forms of Shakespeare, in all three forms of digital Shakespeare becomes less of something we passively watch or study and something we actively use. Bite-sized bards, through their repeatable, intertextual, and playful nature, allow anonymous and individual users to create or make their own Shakespeares. Social bards invite users to interact and participate through its visual rather than textual and verbal performance of Shakespeare. Unmuted bards go beyond the notion of liveness as an emotive feeling by its inclusion and immersion of the audience in the events of the performance. What is latent in all three forms is the essential transformation of the Shakespeare spectator to the Shakespeare user. A common thread amongst these bards is the characterization of engagement that they produce as that of use. Traditionally, It had been big theaters and institutional giants like the RSC, the Globe, and National Theatre that directly contributed to the cultural production of Shakespeare, a fact lamented by Judy Ake in her essay Forests of Silence, claiming that, quote, embeddedness of institutions of academic and cultural production of Shakespeare within globalized economics means that some centers are simply more central. In these institutions, commonly associated with high culture Shakespeare, the spectator played but a passive role, muted in his place in the auditorium. But with digital media comes the rise of small creative groups like Creation Theater, Big Telly, the Candle Wasters, which all acknowledge that the members of the audience are also internet users who can act and who have agency. And while global Shakespeare's is still far from achieving independence from these big institutions, digital Shakespeares offer a potential way to decenter Shakespeare by its fashioning of a new spectator, one that can playfully create Shakespeare online, interact with performances and actors to create a network of community, and participate in the life of a Shakespearean performance. These active verbs create, interact, participate are reinforced by the larger idea of use, where, as Terence Hawkes suggests, Shakespeare doesn't mean, we mean by Shakespeare. Like the early modern theaters of Shakespeare's London, digital performances might, in a sense, allow us to throw stones or fruit or shout curses and acclaims at the bard. Whatever we groundlings might do to Shakespeare on this new stage, what is certain is that we do not mutedly stay in the dark of the auditorium. We leave our mics and our cameras on. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikki. All right. And with that, we will open the floor for the Q&A. So if anyone from our Zoom room here has any questions, please just raise your hand or you can type it in the chat as well. And also for people watching us on Facebook, you may comment your questions and I will read them to Nikki. All right. Any questions from the group? Okay, so maybe while we're waiting for our audience to participate and to ask questions, um, I, I'd like to just congratulate you on the very well delivered and so informative lecture that you gave. I have a very small question that I just popped up in my mind while I was listening, particularly when you were talking about bite-sized bards. So this idea of it's quite raucous, it's irreverent. So I was wondering, during the time wherein all these plays were being played for live audiences in Shakespeare's time, what were some examples of the parodies that kind of mimic the memes that we do today? Are there such kinds of immediate sort of jokes and retellings? And what forms did these take? Were these oral? Were they sort of cartoons? So kind of was just curious about that.
So this is your question is from the early modern period.
Yes, yes, yes.
Right,
Mhm.
right. I think early modern well, context and culture is something that I'm not quite familiar with, especially when it comes to other media forms at the time, like whether it's print uh or other sort of printed performances or sort of forms. So I would imagine that because theater's nature, the scripts back then were constantly changing because this was before print media. There were jokes created by the actors in response to the audience because it was raucous and participatory. So depending on, let's say, the climate of the theater, the behavior of the audiences, actors might respond
Mhm.
or they might have sort of a bag of lines to with which to respond to how the audiences were sort of reacting. So that's one example for Hamlet, where he refers to the groundlings directly and sort of describes them in this particular way, right? So they're incapable of nothing but this.
Mhm.
So I suppose that's one example of how parang they sort of made jokes at the time out of the plays of Shakespeare or out of early modern plays. Some audiences also had table books or sort of a sort of device where they can write. They can write new words, maybe new jokes or new phrases that they get out of the place. So I would imagine that they all just circulated kind of verbally these sort of jokes or parodies in the early modern period. Again, because
Yeah.
I it was before print media. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Thank you so much, Nikki.
yeah,
Definitely. We have a question here from Lori, and then we also have one question from Facebook. So I'll start with Lori's question first. So, congratulations, Nikki. I found your discussion of digital Shakespeare's fascinating and feel that you have contributed significant knowledge, not just about new incarnations of the bard, but also these digital Shakespeare's negotiation of liveness, resistance against the authority of the text and the stage, and the reconfiguration of participatory culture that results in the emergence of modern groundlings. My question has to do with your assertions about the access to and democratization of Shakespeare that
yeah,
these digital Shakespeares provide. How would you address this idea of lively, productive, and
yeah.
agency filled engagements with Shakespeare in the Philippine context? Did you come across any Philippine digital Shakespeares? Can you share some of your thoughts about the potential or limits of digital Shakespeares in the Philippine context in contrast with other Philippine Shakespeares that have already been studied? And this is also in line with the question over on Facebook. Is digital Shakespeare present also in the Filipino context or digital space? If yes, how are they similar and or different from the Western examples that you presented?
Right, right. Yeah, this is a great question. Thank you, Ma'am Lori. So I'll answer this question first. Did you come across any Philippine digital Shakespeares? So, in searching for digital forms of Shakespeare, first I'll answer for the bite-sized bards because they're difficult to trace. So you won't even it. I would imagine that most of them are Western, come from the West. So these memes, again, we don't know who created them. They're shared online so much that the original creator um is lost. No, so but if you look at social media, and search Romeo and Juliet, for example, on TikTok, there's a lot of Filipino digital Shakespeares of students performing. So it's I think in terms of digital Shakespeares in the Philippines, there is presence because it's being taken up in private schools or in schools, and they become like the projects of students. So there's a lot of Romeo and Juliet actually, and there's a lot of sort of reenactments using either YouTube or TikTok, but I find that they it's not quite the the same marriage of stage and medium as these other digital Shakespeares have. No, it's sort of like there's a stage, there's sort of there are actors in front, and then TikTok becomes just a medium for transmitting that sort of performance, but it is present, and there's a lot also. So and I think I don't know if well, Ma'am Lori, you were there in my thesis defense. Back then, I also argued for access, arguing that digital Shakespeare's democratize or makes Shakespeare accessible, I've kind of revised that. I don't talk about access, if you notice, in this particular in this lecture, because it's a point of contention. Digital access isn't universal, so it's not everybody has access to the internet. Not everybody has access to these digital tools, and when um when I talk about access, I also mean it in two ways. Access in a way, in the literal way, meaning entry point, or being able to get a hold of Shakespeare in these digital platforms. And the second way is access in terms of grasping and understanding the content or the material in these digital Shakespeares. So I don't think that digital Shakespeares necessarily make Shakespeare more accessible, right? Another point here is that virtual theater, for example, Unmuted Bards, they charge they charge a small amount to be able to join these Zoom performances, because again uh it's a replacement of theater during lockdown. So these are still actors that still needed to survive, no? So they still needed uh the financial support. And virtual theater affords them that. So I think that there's still a limit in digital Shakespeare, especially in the Philippine context, again because of access. Um and it doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, Shakespeare on the digital platform doesn't necessarily mean access, but those who do have access, and those who sort of performances that have wider reach, they do sort of acknowledge that audiences now seek participation. So I focus more on participation rather than access in this particular version of the study. So there, I hope I answered that question.
All right. So we have another question here from Francis. Thank you and congratulations, Nikki. My question has to do mostly with methodology, so I hope it is okay. I just wanted to know how, as a researcher of digital Shakespeare, do you address the precarity of your research objects? As you know, posts on digital platforms can easily be taken down or removed for whatever reason. As a researcher, how do you protect yourself from such possibilities of loss?
Right. Thank you for that question, Francis. In fact, in revisiting this this thesis, no, so this was in 2019. I found that some of the memes, for especially, I couldn't find them anymore. So in terms of archiving, I do my own sort of really primitive way of archiving, which is, the usual. I just save the pictures. And then in terms of at least those who that appeared in my MA study, the links don't work anymore. So I just have them saved, no, in my hard drive. But luckily, the other bards, no, social bards and unmuted bards, because of the nature of social bards or social Shakespeares, um, the as it is performed, it's already archived. So you just it's easy to go back to, especially for nothing much to do on YouTube and Instagram. So I find that as research objects, um if they're already there online, and they don't take them down, at least for the candle wasters, which is this very small group. um they have other sort of adaptations. So because of the nature, I think, of YouTube, no, and Instagram, and they're already sort of there, they're sort of archived as it's performed, no. So and for unmuted bards, though, unmuted bards, actually they're not as accessible. I've had to ask permission to view the performances, because precisely because these unmuted bards include the faces of the audience. So and they can't publish that, no, because they don't have consent. So in order to access that, I've had to ask permission, and I've also had to say, or to sort of promise that I can't I can't sort of disseminate the performances. So yeah, they're easily taken down, yes, especially those bite-sized bards. So I just do my own sort of way of archiving that. Um and I think by writing about it, there's already it's already sort of protected, or sort of I've already sort of immortalized that performance. So I'm just imagining, what if biglang tinake down yung Nothing Much to Do or yung sa Instagram performance. So but I've already written about it, so I think in a way it's sort of already out there.
All right. Thanks, Nikki. We have a question from Mikey, and Vic is raising his hand here on Zoom. But we do have a Facebook question. So I've put it here in the chat so you could read it. I'll just read it out for the audience as well. Hi, Nikki. Just wanted to know if you were able to participate in the live theaters of Shakespeare online. If so, what is your take on them, and how can we learn from those digital Shakespeares? Plus, in terms of our local productions and how it can help us present Shakespeare to our local audiences.
So unfortunately, I wasn't able to join the actual production. So I got access to it. So I just kind of watched it as you would a film. So unfortunately, I don't have a sort of experience or firsthand um anecdotes as to how it felt. However, reading the articles and essays on these performances, especially Creation Theater's Tempest, and Big Telly's Macbeth, it's really interesting because audience members would kind of you'd see them kind of getting ready because it's their turn, because they might get spotlighted. You see the reactions, and it's great because if you I would imagine that if you're watching it during lockdown in 2020, it really gives a sense of hope, or a sense of community, because you could see their faces, and these are other people, and you're sharing the same Zoom meeting, you're watching the same play, um and it's not quite the same as physical theater, where everybody's in the dark, you can't quite see their reactions. Here, one audience member is spotlighted, and yeah, okay, you could see that they're getting a bit shy, that they're spotlighted, they're shifting in their seats, you could see them with their wines. So it's nice, and it's really it's different, and it's a different way of spectatorship, I think, that creates this feeling of yeah, of togetherness, as well. So and yeah, in terms of our local productions, how can it help us present Shakespeare to our local audiences? So I think this I think we can sort of take stock of digital tools as performance, for in the Philippine context. So seeing as a lot of young people are uh, constantly online, and they find things, they find out about things through TikTok. Even old things like old films, they rediscover it through TikTok. Old artists, so I think there's a lot of potential, really, in digital Shakespeare's, in bringing him to local audiences.
All right. Thanks, Nikki.
I
We have a question here from Mikey. I really enjoyed the lecture, Nikki. That we might be formulate the bardic question, is it Shakespeare though, is very exciting to me. Do you think this is something teachers should teach? Do you think that Shakespeare should be introduced in this way to students? Or do you envision more of a balancing act, a traditional approach to that more intact, authoritative Shakespeare, plus a decentralized Shakespeare once students are more comfortable with the text?
right. Um Yeah, this is I think a balanced approach especially in teaching Shakespeare is great. What I propose though is something is the inverse of what you're saying, Mikey. Here I'm reading that traditional approach to that more intact authoritative Shakespeare, and then a decentralized approach once the students are more comfortable with the text. I would say maybe now maybe we can start with a decentralized Shakespeare, or I would imagine that they would feel a bit more comfortable at first with a Shakespeare that is not on a pedestal, and so that becomes sort of an entry point for them to engage with Shakespeare in that decentralized way, and hopefully then engage with the material later on. And I would that's how I asked my students in English 2-3, what's their first encounter with Shakespeare, and a lot of them say, oh, Taylor Swift is their first encounter with Shakespeare. Yung love story, diba? Which is about Romeo and Juliet, pero happy ending. Some of them cite a cartoon like Jimmy Neutron apparently had a Macbeth episode. And when I begin with that, parang their interest is piqued na parang, oh, how could this really old man Shakespeare parang still be in our cultural consciousness, because he's very much in our cultural consciousness. So I would sort of, yes, propose a sort of balanced approach in teaching Shakespeare, drawing them to the text eventually through these decentralized by showing them that hey, Shakespeare is already in our cultural consciousness. He is very much part of everything, almost everything that we consume, and you're enjoying it, see. So hopefully that begins an engagement with this authoritative Shakespeare, and then after that I think we go back to a decentralized approach, because you might ask them, oh, why don't you make your own digital Shakespeares? How would you decentralize Shakespeare? How would you create Shakespeare for yourself, no, or on your own? So yeah.
Thank you so much. Now we have a question from Vic. Go ahead, Vic.
Hello, Nikki. Thank you so much for that lecture. What I really enjoyed about it is this opportunity to just see one of the most well-known authors in the world canon in a completely new light. And what I'm going to take away the most from your lecture is really the idea of using Shakespeare. Um, so I wanted to ask if you would like to talk about any parallels outside of Shakespeare, because when you talked about how actually when you look at the original context of Shakespeare and you have these unruly groundlings, that also reminded me of the context of ancient Greek theater. Brian Duries, the director of Theater of War, also talks about how um, we're far away from, the amphitheater in ancient Athens, where you have about 10,000 people, the entire community watching the play. So it's really communal, right? And then the word amphitheater really means that the audience can see the performers and vice versa. And that's his way of revitalizing ancient Greek theater in the present. So it's really interesting that actually going back to the original context is also a way of revitalizing theater in the present. So if you want to talk about any parallels similar to ancient Greek theater, I'd be really interested to hear about that. And then my second question is quite similar to Mikey's question. how would in your own, if you can share more about how you teach Shakespeare, like um how can activities centered on the use and digital performance of Shakespeare stand side by side with more traditional assignments like scholarship or scholarly essays? Thank you so much and congratulations on your lecture.
Thank you very much for that question, Vic. So, in terms of parallels, uh, between the original how Shakespeare was originally conceived of and sort of the modern way that we consume Shakespeare. Again, besides the looking at spectators, I think we can sort of take a look at performances in the early modern period, performances in theaters like the Globe or the Rose Theater, as maybe our modern day um uh I wouldn't say Netflix or what, but maybe uh maybe like our modern day, maybe Showtime, or Itbulaga, not in a sense that of course because Eat Bulaga and Showtime, it changes every time, 'di ba? Parang the performances and all of that. And then in the same way, in Shakespeare's theater in London, um, these plays change also every time. And what I'm saying is that in one sort of theater, um, unlike now, parang now, 'di ba, when we hear of a play, it's insular. And this sort of play runs for 2 months. So parang Miss Saigon lang siya for 2 months or something. But in Shakespeare's Globe, because this was the only form of entertainment, they had to change the plays every so often. So in one sort of theater, you could one sort of season has Macbeth and Julius Caesar and Hamlet, and sometimes also played by the same actors or the same company. And because this was sort of the entertainment of the time, yeah, I would sort of parallel that to parang noontime entertainment, or sort of variety shows in our day. So in terms of parallelism, maybe, yeah, maybe that we could think of Shakespeare's theater in that particular way. um and your second question, on teaching, yeah, so in terms of, I suppose, assessment or requirements, we can kind of try to yeah, strike a sort of balance. And the way I do it in my classroom is there is still this more academic uh assessment in the end. So there's sort of a final paper or some essays, but the little activities to get them to read, for example, let's say, an example would be, for example, in The Merchant of Venice, I asked them to look for a photo online, or an artwork that you think might be the place where this scene happens. So I think in terms of getting them to appreciate, to assimilate, and immerse themselves within the world of the place, we can very much use digital tools, without sacrificing the academic side of it. And so the again, so like how I would sort of uh I guess summarize it is, the formative sort of journey towards appreciating and immersing oneself in Shakespeare's texts. One, I think I would use these digital tools now, these centralized uh these decentralized Shakespeares. But then when it comes to the summative sort of assessment, no, or sort of measuring their learning, I'd still kind of ask them to write a scholarly or an academic paper, not just because of scholarships, not just because of the a paper's sake, no, for the sake of just writing a paper, but of course for them to be able to express and write and defend an argument. So yeah.
All right. And I think this is our last question from Lauren. Hi, Nikki. Congratulations on the lecture. Would you know how these digital Shakespeares have changed or made an impact on the physical space of or audience participation in theaters? Have these digital platforms continued to prosper beyond the pandemic? Or if, because audiences can now go to physical theaters, are these digital tools now trying to reach out to a wider non UK or Western audience?
Right. Yeah, so I think uh in terms of whether they persevered, they are and they have been persevering. So Big Telly, for example, the Friar Lawrence's confessional was 2022 actually, so that's 1 year or 2 years after the lockdown. Recently they also staged The Witch of Edmonton, just I think that's last year, 2023. So I think that it can prosper beyond the pandemic. And what I think what happens now is yeah, actually that's a good question. What now, diba? Like after the pandemic, and there's virtual theater. I think there's space for physical theater and virtual theater. The pandemic just sort of introduced um that this becomes a space too, that uh as much as a theater is a space for performance, we can also sort of see that this is another space for performance. So in that sense, they can coexist. Right. And is it are these digital tools now trying to reach out to a wider audience? I'd have to find out, no, if if these sort of smaller groups like Creation Theater or Big Telly, if they have that in mind, if if that's one of their goals, because I think as they were originally conceived to be just really small groups that already from the get-go uh sort of endeavored to seek audience participation even before the pandemic. So for example, Big Telly's Creation Theater's Tempest was actually originally a site specific play. So that just transferred to the virtual medium during the pandemic. So the Tempest was actually originally supposed to be set in a cruise ship, no? And then parang it was this sort of choose your own adventure kind of performance, na na parang what they did to the script is they pared it down to 13 different episodes, no, kind of like also Punch Drunk's Sleep No More, which is a site specific Macbeth set in a hotel, no. So so what I'm saying is that it's not that physical theater or sort of yeah, face to face theater had always been confined in a proscenium kind of format. No, there has been these physical sort of site specific theater even before the pandemic. um and of course, in the pandemic, the virtual space entered that. And I suppose now moving forward, yeah, these digital formats now can coexist with physical theater, with sorry, face-to-face theater. The term physical theater is the term physical theater refers to these performance site specific performances like Sleep No More or The Tempest before. So yeah, I think now we just have this realization or this new sort of space with which to perform, and can potentially attract new audiences, and have a wider sort of reach. um but again, I think I'd have to find out if that is one of their goals, the creation theater in big telly.
All right. And I think that's a great question to end our Q&A and the lecture, questions about what now and moving forward. Thank you so much, Nikki, for the wonderful lecture that you delivered. To our audience on Facebook, thank you so much for joining us. This is the end of our live stream.